Okay, we start. Second part of the paper is on economic aspects. Obviously, the discussion will be again, as before, partially on the presentation of the overview of the report, and then there will be some intervention that are connected more to the themes than to the specifics of the report. In this case, the presentation will be done by Giovanni Gangemi, that will give an overview of the economic perspective of the report. Giovanni.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. Well, I will show some slides about the economic aspects of media pluralism and the impact of new technologies on pluralism and diversity. Well, first of all, I think that it's useful to stress some fundamental concepts of media economy. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with, but I think that it's anyway useful to focus on them. Well, media markets tend to be concentrated markets. This is because of many factors, mainly because of the entry barriers and the high initial cost. So players that are in the market tend to keep the prices high and then to impede the entrance of new players, or rather tend to keep the prices very low and like predatory prices, for example, and this can discourage the entrance again of new players. And also media markets are characterized by low marginal costs, and that determine high economies of scale. This is true especially for broadcasting media, where an additional viewer, an additional consumer does not imply any additional cost, and this is true also for newspaper and printed media, where there are only paper and distribution costs that increase. And this is true also for the internet, even though on the internet we have some costs that are related with the bandwidth consumption that should be anyway taken into account. And also, media markets are characterized by vertical and horizontal integration. Vertical integration is especially when firms are both on the production and on the delivery, content delivery levels, and then can control both of these levels. And horizontal integration is when firms can expand horizontally, distributing their content on many platforms, and this is how we will see in the next slides, even increasing in the converging area, because firms tend to match their audiences. Audiences are decreasing, but they tend to match their audiences on different means of distribution, and so to multiply their content on different platforms and on different means. So all these basic things should be seen in the light of the technological change, the internet, the digital media. All these are producing effects, important effects, relevant effects on the economy of media and on media markets. For example, internet is lowering barriers to entry, and this, of course, is having positive effects on because it's allowing more players to enter the market. But on the same time, we see that there is a great fragmentation of the audience. So we have a multiplication of sources on the supply side, but we have also a fragmentation of the audience on the demand side, and this could mean have more homogeneous and even more attractive groups for new suppliers, but this means also that audience is very dispersed and very fragmented, and it is not so easy to find a critical mass that is profitable for media firms, and this can finally discourage the entrance of new players in the market. So are new technologies, the question is, are new technology, is the internet, are the digital media fostering and are ensuring more diversity, or rather are they producing more concentration? Well, the question has been heavily debated in the last almost 20 years, we can say, but especially in the last 10 years. And the debate has been very well summarized by Professor Noam, who is today with us, and when he described this debate as the media optimists and media pessimists debate, where the optimists are the ones who believe that the internet and the online media are enlarging media market and allowing are leading to more diversity, while the pessimists are the ones who are convinced that just this is the contrary, so that new media are not are leading to a more concentrated market. So it is interesting to go further and to mention. I will thank again Professor Noam. I will mention his theory about the U-shape effect of in the media. So on the one hand we have entry barriers, and on the other hand we have economies of scale. Well, when they both they go in opposite directions, we have, he says, a U-shape effect. This means that when entry barriers increase and economies of scale decrease, this could lead to a more concentration in a first moment, but then there would be more competition in a second moment. But if barriers to entry drop and the economies of scale increase, on the contrary, we see an opposite effect. That is that, and by the way, is the effect that we are having with new technologies, and it is the effect where we have less concentration in a first moment because many players enter the market, but then we will have more concentration because many of these new players won't be able to sustain competition in the market. So if we see from a dynamic perspective this phenomena, we can say that we have a U-shape effect that brings then finally to more concentration. And Professor Baker's theory also is interesting when he says that there is, of course, with new technologies, there is a lowering of distribution costs, but this means also that firms, to keep the prices high, can invest in more in initial cost, especially can invest more resources in on the first copy, and this could lead, of course, to more concentration because not every firm could invest as much that much on the first copy, and so this could lead finally to a reduction of diversity. So whether the pessimists or the optimists are right, the point is that new technologies are raising some concerns about media pluralism and media diversity. Well, I try to summarize and to focus on some of them, and I hope that then the discussion could also go further and explore many of them. Well, first of all, there is an unclear definition of what the relevant markets are. So, for example, Google has 30 billion euros US dollars advertising revenues, but are those revenues exactly comparable to the revenues from News Corp, for example, or for Disney? Well, this is a fundamental question when we have to assess pluralism, when we have to measure pluralism and diversity. And another question is the challenge between the traditional offline media firms and the new online firms, is this competition made on the same level, or is there a lack of a level playing field? Well, we have an effect on the one hand. We have on the online, we have successful players that are the same players that are successful, operate successfully also in the offline media. If we see all the statistics about the most consumed news sites, for example, we see that these are the same providers and the same suppliers that are also in the offline media, coming from the offline media: BBC, CNN, Fox, and the Wall Street Journal, and so on. On the other hand, we have new players, but these new players are mainly content aggregators, such as, for example, Google, and such as Yahoo. Although Yahoo is changing, still is already changing its business model, is going toward a more original content production model, and this is a very interesting trend, I think. And finally, we have the new players that are smaller players, but that find very hard to compete both with traditional players and with new aggregators coming from the online media environment. Another concern is about the tendency to concentration of new markets. Internet is producing new markets such as the search engine, for example, such as the social networks, but all these markets tend to be even more concentrated. We have these two examples of what happened in the recent years in the search engine market and also in the social network markets, where there is this effect that has been called the winner takes all. Google overcame Yahoo in 2004, and then now is 7 times bigger than its competitor. And the same happened with Facebook against MySpace, and this is even more fast. It's even faster than with the search engines. Finally, a last concern can be considered the geographical origin of new media players. For sure, there is a tendency to be more. These new players come mainly from the US, and there is an imbalance between the US and Europe. That is, of course, it's not a new issue, because this always happened in the media market. If we think about what happened in the content industry, in the audiovisual and in the television industry, in the film industry, this is of course not new. But the fact that Europe is not able to conceive and to develop new players able to compete in the worldwide market in the online environment, this should bring us to this could bring some elements of concern. And so we have in many cases a challenge between local-based and well-established media firms on one hand, and on the other hand we have international globalized organization, mainly not coming from Europe. So so far we tried to protect media industry with many tools, such as, for example, quotas for production to protect European contents, and also with public fundings, funding, for example, public service broadcasters. But the question is, are these tools effective in the new online media environment? Well, just to focus on the audiovisual media industry, just to understand which is the trend, I tried to bring some general figures about the audiovisual industry, and we can see that the European media industry, you can maybe is very small, but is the red figure. Grew with 0.5 annual rate, and this is almost 10 times less than what happened in the US industry. So there is a tendency to of an increase of this gap between the American and the European audiovisual in this case, but in general media industry, that should bring another element of concern in my opinion. And so also, it's interesting to note that this happened notwithstanding the fact that European industry is also characterized by the presence of public fundings. So, of course, we had a very difficult period, especially in the last 3 years, for advertising markets. But Europe was not able to overcome these difficulties, notwithstanding the public fundings financing many public service broadcasters. So, if we have to conclude, we have to say that we remark a great diversity. New technologies are bringing a great diversity on the supply side, but these not necessarily correspond to a greater diversity on the demand side. And so the question is whether new technologies are bringing more diversity and more pluralism should be carefully assessed, because it's not automatic. There is not an automatic relation between the increase in the supply side and the increase of suppliers and the increase of pluralism. There is an urgent need for market definition and for a clearer definition of relevant and geographical also market to correctly assess media pluralism. Finally, we have to say that we have an increased fragmentation. Media markets are increasingly fragmented, but these risks to weaken European industry and to make European industry more vulnerable in the globalized economy. So we have also, as I was saying before, to understand whether the current tools that are used to protect media industry are still effective in the online and converging media environment or not. So this is my conclusion, and I will leave the floor to Gillian Doyle from.
So thanks to Pier Luigi and the Centre for inviting me. I've been asked by Giovanni, who I've had the pleasure of working on the report, to focus on quotas and subsidies and ownership restrictions affecting pluralism. And the next couple of papers are going to deal specifically with how changes in technology are impacting on pluralism. So that's not what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to focus on quotas and subsidies, which are quite common sorts of interventions across Europe. and they reflect some of the concerns and sensitivities that came up this morning in Alina's discussion and some of the other discussions. And they also reflect a response to, I suppose, the economic fact of life, that media industries are prone to oligopolization, and the reasons why concentrations and oligopolization are prevalent in the industry have been touched upon here by Giovanni, stemming from the public good characteristics of media content and the fact that there are low marginal reproduction costs. So there are numerous economic incentives, as we know, towards achieving scale and towards achieving cross-sectoral presence to exploit economies of scope, and towards vertical expansion to try and gain greater control over the vertical supply chain and more certainty. So the fact that media organizations will pursue economic gains of various sorts through expansion is reflected in, well supported by empirical data about actual levels of ownership and concentration across European national markets, within which there are many instances to be found of concentrations and oligopoly. And over the years, regulators in most European Union member states have attempted to curb media empire building by imposing upper restrictions of one kind or another on levels of media and cross-media ownership. Now, the primary raison d'etre for those regulations is, of course, pluralism, but it does have an impact in two areas of concern for policy making. There's the economic dimension to it as well, which is partly to do with competition, and when that's the case, then the impetus to curb media empire building, well, I mean it calls for a common approach, which is about restricting the size of media organizations, but ceilings on and constraints over cross-border expansion or on cross-sectoral development can also result in unwanted economic welfare losses if they stop media firms from realizing all of the efficiencies and the economies of scale and scope that they would like to exploit. I mean, to the extent that strategies of expansion do actually give rise to or create ways in which media firms can organize their resources more efficiently, and we know that they do, then there is actually going to be an economic argument in favor of encouraging rather than constraining those kind of growth strategies. And it is clear that policymakers in many European countries are very alert to those economic arguments and that point of view, because they have been recycled copiously into the quite often policy discussions which have justified a progressive deregulation of media ownership restrictions at member state level in countries including the UK, France, Germany. That process has been accompanied by arguments about the need to avoid impeding European players from developing as strong and efficient indigenous firms capable of competing in global markets. Does it matter for pluralism that media ownership restrictions across Europe have been whittled away? I've been asked to talk about how these might affect pluralism. Well, in industries that are characterized by economies of scale, diversity is not a natural outcome. Media is not any different from any other industry characterized by economies of scale. And the intention behind media ownership rules is to curb the extent to which individuals and organizations that are pursuing their own interests can, at the same, through expanding their media organization, can accumulate excessive control over the traffic of ideas to the public. So if by curbing media empires you encourage a wider diversity of suppliers, then the risks of any individual voice becoming too influential is reduced. But when it comes to evaluating the exact impact of media ownership restrictions on pluralism, the picture is somewhat clouded and confused by the fact that, as Paolo mentioned this morning, pluralism is a bit of a slippery concept, and also there are a number of factors that bear upon what level of pluralism you can expect, media pluralism you can expect to find. Issues such as the wealth of a market, the state of distribution technologies, the regulatory environment. Certainly diversity of ownership is one aspect of this, and diversity of media content obviously matters as well. But the relationship between concentrations of media ownership and diversity of content is a complicated one. As Paolo was mentioning, sometimes large organizations contribute to a wider range of products through strategies of segmentation of output, or at least they contribute to the appearance of a wider range of products. But I think a question we might ask ourselves is to what extent products that are supposedly distinct and different from each other actually are. Those products that come about through strategies of segmentation that we see, for example, in magazine publishing, sometimes the level of reuse of material in order to create so-called different products and to segment the market very efficiently is very high, and so you could argue that this contributes to uniformity and to, rather than to diversity. It fails what Steve referred to as the originality test there. So whereas Paolo argues that because of strategies of segmentation, pluralism is a necessity of the market, I think a counter-argument there might be that through strategies of segmentation, pluralism is an illusion of the market sometimes. But the tall and short of it is that the cause and effect relationship between concentrations of media ownership and pluralism is complicated, and at times it's somewhat contradictory. So media ownership rules are important, but we also need, or other measures can play a significant role in supporting pluralism. Support for content is often used across Europe to promote more indigenous production with a view towards increasing plurality. It can come in a couple of different forms. There's imposing restrictions on imports of competing non-domestic material, or it may come through subsidies to encourage more production or distribution of whatever form of content is seen as desirable minority language output, for example. Now, a typical example of that first approach using protectionist measures would be quotas or limits in relation to how much locally made versus how much foreign made content suppliers can provide to audiences. These are common in European audiovisual industries. They reflect concerns that have been referred to by Giovanni about the vulnerability of domestic markets to a predominance of imported material, especially from the US, which is and remains by far and away the largest exporter of television and also film content globally. There are a variety of factors that explain the success of US exporters, advantages of scale, advantages of wealth, language, but this state of affairs has sparked concerns about the impact on languages, diversity, pluralism. So a compulsory broadcasting quota that restricts the level of time that can be given over to transmission of imported work. So how do quotas impact on pluralism? Well, they set out to redistribute demand in favour of local television content producers. However, to the extent that domestic prices might be higher than import prices for the same performance characteristics, if you want to buy single transmission rights for attractive, fresh drama content, for example, then you may find that the price for domestic content is higher because there is not a large supply of second-hand material. So because of this, quotas, although they redistribute demand in favour of local producers, they can also have the effect of putting up costs for broadcasters. Now, whether or not they actually affect pluralism and diversity, depends on whether they're strictly enforced. And there is a rather loosely phrased compulsory quota for European-made content in the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, previously Television Without Frontiers, but because of lax enforcement, it has been criticised for a failure to meaningfully reshape or in fact have any impact at all on patterns of trade or consumption of television content across Europe. By contrast, China operates a quota system that curbs the level of imported films that are allowed into the market every year to 20, and that's highly effective in restricting the inflow of films into China. So content quotas can influence what's supplied and consumed, but if they're not enforced, they won't work. But that's not an argument against quotas as such. Another method used to promote pluralism in EU member states is subsidisation, perhaps of organisations of public service broadcasting entities that are committed to widening access to a diversity of material, so they're very much in harmony with the principles of pluralism, or perhaps subsidies to support specific forms of content that are deemed a good thing as far as extending diversity. The press subsidies in the Nordic countries were mentioned earlier, many subsidies to audiovisual industries as well. It should be acknowledged that the opportunity cost of subsidising these support measures is considerable. I mean, in terms of how that money could be used otherwise to positive ends. But the benefit is the availability of more locally made content, clearly enough, which contributes to greater diversity and pluralism. It might be argued that the positive gains to society through having that additional diversity of content and more indigenously made content, that grants allow firms to internalise that benefit, so it corrects what might be seen as a failure of the market to ensure that a sufficient amount of indigenous material, such content, is being supplied. It's worth noting as well that the purpose of grants and subsidies is not just to encourage greater plurality of content for audiences. They're also supposed to improve the competitiveness of domestic content creators in home markets and in international markets. And this is where subsidies come in for some serious criticism from economists anyway, on the basis that they can have precisely the opposite effect than the one intended. Some would argue that the provision of public grants for filmmakers and for audiovisual content creators is far more likely to delay and prevent the development of the necessary skills to compete in international markets than it is to actually foster competitiveness. So this is something of a conundrum for policymakers. But even if subsidies are guilty as charged of, for example, contributing to a culture of greater dependence amongst indigenous content makers, they still, as far as audiences are concerned, are quite immediately provide access to a wider range, a more pluralistic array of content than otherwise would be present. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much, Gillian. I will leave the floor to Noam. Professor Noam, yeah. You have some slides? Yeah.
There are, thank you. I'd like to do two things here. First, to stay on time. Second, I'd like to do two things. First, to present an empirical analysis of present media structure, and because this is a European event, an audience, I will focus on Europe. And the second one is I'd like to analyze the trends and what they portend for the future. Now, I am mindful that in Italy, after last week, I might go to jail for being wrong about the future. But if I do, I will be in good company with probably most of the macroeconomics profession. So let me start with the structure of media industries. This is obviously not just an economic question, but a very public question, and people are going on the streets and demonstrating, and there are, as Giovanni mentioned, two perspectives, the pessimist perspective, such as from Larry Lessig, a good friend, who fears that, as he said more than 10 years ago, that there will be only 3 companies controlling more than 85% of the world's media. And on the other side, people for whom the issue is solved by the emergence of the internet and its opportunities. And Adam Thierer, of a Washington think tank, believes that there is no problem. It's not that the glass is half full, half empty, but there is no problem whatsoever. So what do we think about that? Well, to some extent, it's an empirical question, even though most sides really don't like numbers, particularly when they don't show, when they're not in total conformity with their strongly held belief system. So what we've done at Columbia is empirical studies, first in the United States, and then about the world. And we've kind of analyzed with teams in all countries. Professor Ricceri is part of the Italian team. For example, we analyzed about 80% of the countries. They account for 80% of the world's population, 80% of the world's by GDP. It's a project supported by the Open Society Institute. Thank you very much. Now, of the European countries, I will report now mostly about them. We have here of the EU countries, these 12 countries, I believe they are, and of non-EU European countries, we have a few more. So, what do we find? Well, let me just first address an issue because there's a certain smugness, if I may say so, in Europe about Europe. And that kind of basically says the problem of Europe can be summarized by 3 words: Berlusconi, Murdoch, and Hollywood. Well, not so fast, because actually what our results show that European countries media in European countries are more concentrated than one would expect relative to other parts of the world, given income, given traditions, given geography and population. So the media industries that we're analyzing are, oops, not here, there's too many. Here there are 13 media industries we're analyzing, and what we find here is, and obviously I have only 12 or so minutes, and that's kind of like discussing the history of Florence in 12 minutes, but if you look at that second set of bars, EU, you will see what the average media concentration is averaged for each country, weighted average for those approximately 9 content industries for the moment. Then we'll go to the platform industries, and you can see that for EU countries, they're basically at the world average, but not better than that. And they are worse than in North America in terms of concentration, and even slightly more so than in Asia-Pacific countries. They are lower than Latin America, the emerging BRIC countries, and the Middle East, but those are probably not the comparison countries. And if we now go further to platform media, which are like telecom, wireless, wireline, and so on, we have also similar results. EU basically at world average, North America lower, Asia Pacific frequently similar, sometimes better, sometimes worse. And we can kind of go on to other comparisons too, industry by industry, newspapers, broadcast television, satellite cable, multi-channel, and so on. The results tend to be fairly consistent. Now, if we look at cross-media measures, not just an industry by industry, but assuming that one company might be present in 2, 3, 4 media industries, and I will not discuss the methodology here for a moment, except to say that whatever we do consistently, and that is one of the contributions that we at the center of this study at Columbia have done, is to assure a consistency across countries, across industries, and across time. So whatever the methodological flaws might be or differences that people might occur, at least we are consistent and we can compare. So if we look at the cross-ownership measures, which we call the Media Power Index, and we look at the National Media Power Index and regional ones, here again we see that the EU kind of at world average, but worse than some other parts of the world. And if we look at this for platform media, it is a similar result. If we look at it only for news media, and here we do the weighting not so much by revenues as we did before, but by attention given to these news media based on surveys, we also come to very similar and consistent results. All right, now, so in some ways I think there is a problem. There's less of a problem if you look at it from a perspective of voices, defined not so much by market share, but simply as media independent from each other, voices present, whatever the market share is, as long as it's above 1%. And there, the voices per capita in Europe are indeed higher. Good news. However, there's a reason for that, and that is the relatively large number of smaller countries in Europe. Smaller countries with some wealth tend to have a higher number of voices per capita. In fact, if you look at it on a country-by-country basis, the highest one is Israel. And then it's Ireland and other small countries, Switzerland, Sweden, Portugal, Finland, Netherlands, Taiwan, Belgium, and so on. And so the larger countries, the Italy, the Germany, the France, the United States, quite low down there, surprisingly low. I mean, disconcertingly low. Now, what about the internet as the savior? The reality is that the internet, for technical and structural and economic reasons, is much less diverse and open than people imagined just a few years ago. Just think about the various internet niches. Google in its niche, eBay, Facebook, and so on and so forth. In each particular sector, there are some very dominant companies, and the logic is pretty obvious. It's high fixed costs, low marginal costs, high economies of scale, high network effects. If you put all these things together, there are dominant companies. And in fact, Jillian's oligopoly, sometimes one would be lucky to have such an oligopoly in this particular sector. So if we look at the internet media, you will see, first of all, you will see on the scale here that these concentration numbers are very high. A highly concentrated industry starts at 1800 approximately, and here we have a world average of over 2000. We have, again, Europe higher than North America, but North America rising fairly steeply, a disturbing type tendency. If we look now here at online news and online news media relative to newspapers, here's one of the observations we can make. In many countries, indeed, the blue bar is are newspapers, the red bar are online news. In many countries, concentration, the red bar, is indeed lower than the blue bar. More openness, less concentration, good. But not everywhere at all, because if you look over at the at the right side of the scale, whether it's United States or Germany or Japan, online news media are actually more concentrated than print media. And the intuition is probably that of Germany or the United States have a lot of kind of regional newspapers, smallish type newspapers, in contrast, say, to the UK, which is a national newspaper system. But in the United States or Germany, it seems that that online news is national, and in consequence is more concentrated than the offline news. Now, one of the things that we observe is that content media, but it's pretty obvious that content media are more concentrated, are less concentrated than platform media. Platform media, the red line, very high and declining. Content media, the blue line, much lower but increasing. They're converging towards each other. And the question then is, what are the kind of the larger trends? One of the things that we observe, although I have to say this is at this point an analysis for the United States only, is that there are certain kind of ups and downs. It's the U-curve that Giuseppe spoke about, in that one could, but it's a oscillation around an axis that is increasing. So it might go down a little, it might go up again, but the overall tendency has been, in recent decades, an increase. And another observation that we make, as you can see from this particular graph here, is that there are oscillations that are different for platform media and for mass media, for content media, that the two, in fact, are converging towards each other. And the reason for that is that these content media are becoming more technologically advanced, more capital intensive, and their fundamental market structures, therefore, are resembling more those of platform media in the past. Now, forgive me for a second. So, what about the future? Here, unfortunately, I have to show you some of my kind of anticipation of the future of video media and why I believe that this is going to be a real problem. This is traditional television, and the second generation was a widening, more channels, more of everything. And people kind of often believe that that's where things will be going with online television, simply more of the same. But that's clearly not what's going to happen, because we do have trends, we do have changes. The trends increase of speed going over more than 100 years of transmission speed. The reduction in the price of distribution, that is similarly a kind of a secular trend. The reduction in the price of content, which is also kind of on a per bit basis, which has also been extraordinary. And all those things lead to not just a widening of alternatives, but also to a deepening, to a greater richness of content. And that greater richness includes several dimensions. It includes 4K and 8K type screens and displays, a much sharper, larger, and therefore sharper image. It includes three-dimensionality. It includes person-to-person interactivity, and the model might be interactive games that have become popular, or there may be person-to-computer video interactivity. This might not be right for the consumer market, but this might be, all right? And that's probably going to be available within a few months. And the main problem here is just the powering, the battery issue. Or the interactivity of immersion through virtual worlds and avatars where you can put yourself into the action, immerse yourself in the action. This is you, just better looking. Now then you can think of yourself. Here's an image. This is a 10-year-old film or so, The Gladiator. already there, everything that you see there is essentially computer generated or superimposed in some way. The only thing that is kind of natural is Russell Crowe's head. But if it's Russell Crowe's head, why not your head or somebody else's head? In other words, you can start to play with the action, to move around, to interact with other people, to affect the plot line, and you can then see yourself marching up in the Legion up the Aegean coast, or you participate in sports events or kind of on the sidelines, and you can look around, or you can participate in other sports, or you can test drive, market cars, you can tag along on a expedition to the Himalayas, and you can do all kinds of things that you didn't imagine before. Now, what is important is that those things are not cheap. People have been talking about this kind of long tail and that everybody can be a media provider. Sure, in the same way that everybody can photocopy some and create a newspaper and sell it on the street corner. And there will be a lot of it, no question about it. However, at the premium end, things will be more expensive than ever. So if you just look at the increase in the number of technicians, of computer specialists for the various computer-generated special effect films, whether it's Star Wars and leading to 500, or Avatar that leading to about 800 computer graphic artists, 800, all right? And there's no reason to assume that that's the end, because expectations rise. And as that happens, these things are not only expensive, but they also have to interact to the extent that we have different devices, different platforms, different networks, different devices and users and technology standards. How do they work together? Well, there are several ways to do that. And one of the ways is to have a global standardization or regional standardization, which sounds like a good idea, except it would take decades and it would be obsolete by the time that it would be agreed on, and it would become highly politicized. Much more likely is that there will be these clouds created by companies, whether they're Apple or others, that will do the interoperating within their cloud. And those kind of companies could be an Apple or a Google or a Netflix. It could also be commercial companies, some of the traditional media companies, or it could be a company such as the BBC. So there's nothing there that says traditional companies could not be part of it, at least the more advanced forward-looking ones. But on the whole, we're talking here about a highly complex kind of media system which requires expertise in consumer electronics, in software, in integration, and in various engineering, alpha tests, beta tests. These are very expensive operations, and as such, they lead to higher scale. They're kind of easily globalized. Therefore, they will lead to very large companies serving world market. I would think that the future is that of two kinds of companies, these big tentpole type companies, integrator companies, and then there will be smaller companies, a lot of small little providers of specialized inputs and services around those tentpole companies. But on the whole, I think that's where things are going. And that's the conclusion, therefore, is that media concentration trends that I've kind of identified here and that our teams have identified here will continue into the future. And market solutions are not likely to, or technical solution to affect it, because in fact it is the technological trends that are at the root of it. And therefore, if you don't like those results, and I don't, you have to do something else about it. And those could be some forms of public solutions. Now, which ones we can argue over? And I would just say that the two most obvious ones are probably not good ideas. The first one is to use the old system and just superimpose it on the new. That's kind of like the Brussels approach on linear online television. And the second approach is to wrap yourself around some kind of a flag, whether it is the Korean flag or the Chinese flag or the European flag or whatever, and then say, we have to do this as part of some kind of industrial development, otherwise we will kind of fall behind, and therefore we have to do this for us and keep the others out. I think this is inherently an international medium. And furthermore, and my last point, it really has to be first an intellectual exercise of people like those around the table, just to think these things through conceptually before we rush into kind of regulatory governmental solutions. First, let's kind of think what the issues, kind of how to handle this. And relatedly, it has to be done soon. Many of the things that are described are obviously 5, 10 years down the road. But once they are here, it will be very hard to change them. They have to be thought through in advance, otherwise the facts on the ground will take over. And it is for that reason that we at Columbia are trying to establish some principles for that kind of next generation cloud of cloud television. And those of you who would like to work with us directly or indirectly, we'd love to have you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Norm. I leave the floor to Marco Gambaro.
Okay, thank you very much. Just few remarks on some economic topics linked to pluralism and media pluralism. The first topic is the relevant market definition. Both for economic concentration and for pluralism, we need to measure in some way the concentration of the market, that is, how many operators there are in the market. But to measure the concentration, we need a good definition of the market. The traditional solution is to measure single media concentration in a single country. That is, with some indicators, Erfindal index, market share of 4 first operators, and so on. So how big is the concentration in newspaper in Italy or in television in UK? But this solution seems to be not so good for the technological development, for the enlargement of the market, and for the globalization. For instance, it makes no sense to measure newspapers' concentration at a national level. In US, we have almost around 1,000 newspapers, but there are few dozens of cities where there are more than one newspaper. So the practical market concentration in US for newspaper is a monopoly in every single town. And there is no overlapping of consumption between one town and the other town. For television, usually the concentration at national level is a good proxy, because television, at the moment, television follow the national boundaries. But for YouTube, it makes no sense to consider some concentration level of some relevant market at a national level. And different information can have different relevant market. For instance, for the news, in the news compete, the major competitor in media terms are television, newspaper, news site, and radio. But if you consider fiction, then the competitors are television, theater, no radio, no newspaper, home video, and internet. So you have different competitors, and you need to take into account the full range of competitors when you consider how many voices you have. And also inside the news, if you consider not a broad category of content, but a smaller category of content, also inside the news that are more interesting for us in pluralistic term, you have different competitor in different category of news. If you consider the financial information that was given in newspaper traditionally and now are not, or if you consider the comments, or if you consider the hard news, or if you consider what you find in Sunday supplement, each of these news category has a different relevant market, because different kind of operator can supply this kind of information to the consumer, and you have to take in account this different situation and organization of the market when you make general proposition about media diversity, of media pluralism. That is important to make contingent analysis and to make a clear and subjective in some way market definition statement before considering any concentration measures. This brings us to a second topic, that is the topics of the bundle. Media are usually bundle of different information sold together for a single price. The technicality is that this is based on complementarity of demand. That is, not every people that buy a single copy of a newspaper is interested in a full range of information that can find on that copy of newspaper, on all the 300 articles that typically you can find of a single copy of newspaper. But you buy the newspaper. Some people is interested in the front page, some people in media, in film commentaries, some people in other information. But when a new media or a new platform appears in the market, the traditional media fears for substitution. That is, newspaper fear to be substituted by internet. But if you are a bundle, it is not necessary that appear on the market a full substitution subject. That is, someone that gives the same information that you can find on a newspaper or you can find in a television channel. The bundle is an equilibrium that was built over the years or sometime over the centuries that put together some kind of information that several group of people want to buy in a way that give you money from the reader market and from the advertising market. But it's a fragile equilibrium. And also, if only some kind of information that are supplied by a specific medium, for instance, newspaper, are supplied free from another media, for instance, internet, the bundle can collapse. Also, if there is not a full substitution. So there are some kind of information, and for that kind of information, we don't have practical substitution in the new platform, but the bundle can anyway collapse. And this can be a problem, both for competition and more for pluralistic and plurality of voices. A second observation is that concentration level can considerably change if depending on the vertical layer that we consider. For instance, television markets are roughly concentrated, and if you consider the European country, the typical organization of the market is that 2 or 3 major suppliers get the majority of the market. With digital television, there is a lowering barrier to enter. There are more small channels that enter in the market, but basically you have 2 or 3 operators that dominate the market. But if you consider news, and if you consider the wholesale feed supplying, that is the news agency that supply the video feed, that is an essential ingredient to build a newscast, there is just 2 competitors in the world market that are APTN and Reuters. And this is the 2 major competitors, just 2. One is US-based and one is maybe European. And there are new challengers, mainly regional. The more interesting on that probably is Al Jazeera. But other operations are not so successful. For instance, the ABU operation of exchange of feed for a newscast did not succeed in becoming a viable competitor for 2 reasons mainly. The first reason is that the feed is made available after it is broadcasted the first time from the original newscast. And that makes this feed usually old. The second reason is a public service approach and not a customer approach. The typical situation for a wholesale operation in video feed is that someone telephones you at 10 o'clock p.m. and say, well, for tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock I want a troop in that place, and please give me the feed in half an hour. And the typical answer of a public service organization in Europe is, well, maybe tomorrow at 10 o'clock someone will take in charge your request. And so it is impossible to organize such a speed market in this way. Such concentration level can be a problem for the European Union, but it is not easy to promote or to sustain a new player in such a competitive market. But at this level, to have just two international operators can be a relevant problem. A third topic is the impact of internet on traditional media and on pluralism. And this impact is ambiguous and is a mix of different trends and of different trends. Well, with the internet, lowering distribution barriers make it easy for every potential sources to disseminate information and news. So there are more sources, more voice in some way. But there are star economic phenomena, that is some winners-take-all framework of competition, and so just few blogs or news sites that get a disproportionate number of page view. You need here to measure the page view, not the unique visitors, because the unique visitor is a measure of coverage, not a measure of consumption. The traditional media face competition and sometimes lose market share. That is, the problem is that for each reader or listener, a newspaper or television lose in the traditional market and gain in the internet market, they lose money because there are less. It's more difficult to get a premium price on the internet for the intense competition and so on. But at the same time, the lowering of distribution barrier and the technological innovation make the potential visibility for every minor or niche sources higher. That is, everyone that disseminates information can disseminate them and get visibility. Obviously, not many audience, as Giovanni pointed out before, but potentially it has. But this really happens only when there are particular occasions or some resonance phenomenon. That is when, usually fueled by social network, a particular piece of news that everyone say this is an important piece of news, and so everyone go to see that particular site. But usually that site do not get a large audience or large market share. And this means that it is true that we have a potential visibility that only few times happens in reality. But this potential threat to entry in some way make it difficult for traditional media and for government to distort or to conceal particular news. Because if there is a strange move, then this kind of phenomenon of resonance can be easily implemented. But in the whole, and this is a real problem, internet did not generate nor support large editorial group or staff that produce original content. And that is a problem, because the traditional media that are a bundle can collapse because some single pieces of the bundle is eroded. And at the same time, the biggest group in internet did not support editorial staff. nor Yahoo, nor Google, not Facebook, not Twitter, and so on. They support new way to disseminate information. This is important, but the particular role of a group that interpret the reality of a country, that put in context the news, that make agenda setting and everything, this at the moment, we have perhaps Huffington Post as an example, but no more than that. And finally, on the supply side, we usually consider the demand side, that is the threat of substitution between the internet and traditional media. But on the supply side, the internet and digitalization are changing the way in which information and news are produced. The core skills for professional journalists will evolve toward monitoring less in searching and producing the news, and more in monitoring and managing multiple sources. The boundaries between professional and amateur producing news is blurring. And this is a problem also for what we consider pluralism, or what we consider freedom, because the freedom of a journalist is different, maybe in some way, of a freedom of a single citizen that is able to put a news in a blog, in a particular blog. And the reason because these boundaries between professional and amateur is blurring is that quality that non-professional sources can exhibit is growing, and is not so different from the quality usually exhibited by the professional. And until now, this particular problem affected the newspaper, but in the next few years, this will affect television too. In video producing, in video news producing, traditionally, a very costly and heavy technology generated production process, heavy and slow production process. That is, to produce a live event, you need 3 days in advance to call, arrive there with a big truck, to connect with satellite, to use 7 persons and 7 cameras, and to have there 10 to 15 people that can't move more than 15 meters from the original track. And that's the typical production process for news. But with technological advance and less costly equipment, this makes possible to use more flexible and more lethal production technology. And the impact can be very hard. Consider that a typical newscast, the yearly cost of a typical newscast is around 30 to 40 million euro per year. And if you reuse a lot the news, the feed you produce, with the same amount of money you can produce a 24-hour news channel, for roughly. But with light production process, you can produce something quite similar for an amount of money in the range from 5 to 8 million euro per year. That is some 10 times less. If it is true, every news site will add full video coverage, probably in the future. Every news site of a traditional newspaper that can add a full video coverage. That means more sources, but smaller sources, less institutionalized, more fragmented, and that use more the video feed of the only 2 international operators to get the results. And finally, the conclusion. The combining effect of market enlargement and new platform and the reducing barrier to entry foster multiplication of sources, but from fragmentation of audiences. It seems to me that to discuss pluralism and variety in media, a contingent evaluation of relevant market seems essential to evaluate concentration and pluralism. And in some way, we need to adapt the notion and the indicators of pluralism and media freedom to that new digital environment, taking into account the different pattern of consumption and the different pattern of production. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. We have a few minutes for questions, intervention.
I have two questions. One, it's a remark for Professor Noam. The second one is for Professor Gambaro. I think that in your presentation is emerging a really interesting bridge between the economic dimension and the legal constitutional one, where you pointed out how the concentration in the online printing media, it's higher where there is, it's higher than offline printing, where there is a more unitary system, where there is a decentralized system, so in constitutional terms, a federal or regional frame of government, it's much less, the difference is much less higher. So I would like, if it's possible, to elaborate a little bit more on this, because from my point of view, it's really interesting to see how the local interest for printing could, in a way, make difference in the concentration. The question for Professor Gambaro is the following. It's maybe a little bit undervaluated, the competition between search engines. And if it is, which would be the relevant market in geographic terms? Because I think that this could be really crucial to understand how the competition between search engines would be, in a way, could be in a way more important for the application of antitrust to the new media.
Different media platforms have different characteristics, and electronics have long been more national than print publications, and television has been more national than radio. And internet media are actually expanding this now probably to the global sphere, so that you will have not only national papers where you now have regionals, but you will have kind of global. I think we heard about the Reuters and the AP. They have in the past been intermediated through newspapers, but there's no particular reason why that has to continue. So you would have kind of already in the United States, many people read or watch BBC or The Guardian, actually, alternative media, and so Al Jazeera was also mentioned. So we do have now kind of the emergence of global media more than we had in the past. In the past we had it for music in particular, and for TV/Hollywood film type productions, but there's no reason why this would not continue.
Yes, we do not consider usually search engine as a media company, but consider what really makes search engine. They offer a service that is quite similar to editorial service. That is, they found the information you want in that moment. That is quite similar to what, in a different way, makes newspaper or television. They offer information and you choice. They also in the that means that in some way search engine is a content media, is an automated content media. They make this search automatically and not with people that write the article or produce a show. In this way, there is some kind of competition. I don't think that it's difficult to say which is the proper relevant market for search engine, but surely it is more than national, usually. But you have to take into consideration the two-sided market character of media market and its search engine in particular. That is, for advertising market, probably a national boundary is rational. But if you consider the editorial side, you have to consider a global market perspective.
Another aspect that relates to that is the greater ability of online media or necessity to provide additional information. The idea is always, what people have been saying, is if you want to have more information, you can have more information, whereas the newspaper right now is essentially an average product. People pick and choose, but suppose you want to have more information about the chemical industry or about Afghanistan or whatever, you need more and more information. And that makes it more expensive to produce in an extraordinary high way. There's no way in which a traditional newspaper organization can actually produce day in, day out all this information. So it does become that kind of integrator of specialized information providers around. Again, it kind of changes the scale nature. On the advertising, I would say the advertising markets tend to be localized, but that is true, or that is national. But you have kind of already advertising agencies that are quite global, so there must be something about the scale here that is kind of not just national. And in a future advertising environment in which things are much more personalized, you get into much more of the Google mode, in which kind of the behavior of people, the preferences, the past media choices, and so on, combine into the serving of advertising. And here too, that is going to be a platform that is largely to be global in nature rather than national, though it might be located. Google operations will be kind of located in various countries, but on the whole, the principle and the technology will be international.
I would like to go to a different aspect that was mentioned by Gillian Doyle and the quota. Because that is still in my mind when you said the Audiovisual Media Service Directive hasn't been very efficient. I'm not sure that I agree entirely, but we should not forget that the Audiovisual Media Service Directive is a European framework. It needs to be transposed into national law. And if you look now not to China but to France, you will find that it's highly efficient in France. They have high quotas, they are very much enforced. It's also a matter of culture, cultural pride, support of the cultural industry. However, of course, the European quota then changes in something like a French quota in the way it's applied. But it's not, you cannot really say that it was not working in no respect. And as to the on-demand situation and the quota, I think it's far too early to say anything because people haven't yet come to terms to really implement that quota and to find out how they could promote European works over the internet. There's an interesting new development in Belgium. They have found a system and they are about to tell it to the world and to share how they think they could do it. But I think there you should maybe wait another 3, 4, 5 years to really say something. It's really too early. They have had a rough time implementing the Audiovisual Media Service Directive in the on-demand context. So let's still wait and hope.
Yes, I agree with you that where quotas are properly enforced, and France has been exceptional in this respect, it's certainly not the same in the UK or Ireland or many markets. You might look at Greece. Then they haven't had any impact. I guess that was the point I was making in many markets, but it's true that in Francophone markets there's been much more enthusiasm for proper enforcement. I think some of the wider issues that have come up are quite interesting as well. I mean, it seems that there's agreement around the table that the market, that the market dynamics and the technological dynamics are moving, are likely to support continued high levels of concentration. So the question is, well, how might these be tackled effectively in the future? And I was very interested I think Professor Noam's very good point that we need to think about this seriously and finding new solutions. But you know, I suppose I'd like to hear more discussion about any thoughts that people have on that front. I mean, I think, you know, media ownership restrictions, quotas, subsidies have all played their part in trying to keep markets open. You could argue that greater transparency is something that's going to be talked about this afternoon would be helpful also, because for those of us that, for example, are using search engines to access content, and it's now a crucial interface, it's not obvious how the algorithms work that through which the content recommendations that come to us, how they are arrived at. So greater transparency might actually be helpful. I'm just thinking that it's, you know, been conceded that changing technologies are not going to resolve this problem. The market is not going to deliver pluralism into the future, and I think there are some causes of concern about monopolization of access points to media, and not just through search engines, but some of the other players mentioned by Giovanni, the social networking sites with recommendations, content aggregators, etc. So we do need to think, and I suppose I'm interested in what positive propositions people have about how we can resolve the need for pluralism into the future.
Question for Professor Noam about your sample for the European Union. Among your countries, you don't have any Eastern European country, although there are 10 of them. So I would like to ask about the reason, and is it about problems with data collection or transparency of data in this field? And without this, do you have any knowledge about media concentration in that part of Europe? Indicators according to your research questions or whatever?
We do have Poland and we have Russia. But it is true that we should have more. We did try, including through the Open Society Institute, and we could not get somebody in Hungary, say, or where else did we try? Romania. We just couldn't get them. Just as we couldn't get somebody in Greece, say. So it's not, there was no particular target for or against any particular region. It is clear, however, that one of the reasons why we didn't get them was because it was probably hard for researchers to do. One comment about the quotas. I'm in agreement that there should be something done for media pluralism and diversity, but it will cost money. And the approaches that often have been taken are trying to do these things on the cheap, off budget. So a quota is kind of cheap. The costs are buried. And I think there's a real, from a free speech perspective, real problem. I mean, imagine you would say that there would be only 20% of American science papers should be published in a physics journal or something along these lines. So there's something really kind of objectionable to that. Secondly, the second approach is that through the tax system of giving investors some tax breaks so that they will invest in domestic productions. And that must have been, to an economist, the most inefficient possible system that could be conceived, by giving essentially rich investors breaks of which only a certain small amount actually benefits production. So I think one has to face the issue honestly and then go through various mechanisms, public broadcasting might be one of them, to support pluralism and diversity rather than through the tax system or through the quota system.
Yes, to Noam again. In all your charts, figures, Middle East was at the top. Can you say something more? How? Why? What's the situation? How come?
Middle East was a bit of a grab bag of countries, because here too we have a very good chapter on Egypt, but it was a chapter written after the change in Egypt, but it analyzing the pre-spring type media. We have a chapter on Israel and one on Turkey, and I think those are the three countries of that region. So I would not take that to be quite representative of the entire region. However, if I had to guess, is that the other countries that we have not covered are pretty bad, actually, when it comes to concentration. I mean, just look around the region and see what there is. You don't really get much diversity.
The last question.
Actually, it's not much of a question as a remark on the quotas and the ownership restrictions. And I'm a bit skeptical, considering the technological developments, how effective are these measures nowadays? And in terms of the ownership restrictions, to be honest, I haven't conducted research for all the European member states, but as far as I understood, the ownership restrictions take the form of market share thresholds. And as far as I saw, they range from 20-25% to 30-35%, especially in merger cases, which, depending on the particularities of each media market, can be excessively high. And I think that this indicates the power of media lobbies when it comes to adopting an instrument aimed at protecting media pluralism. So leaving that aside, also, I also think it depends on the particularities of the media markets. In what sense? For example, in several media markets which are national in scope, in many cases, maybe the advertising spend is it's just too limited. It cannot sustain more than a few broadcasters. So in that case, instead of thinking like rigid market share thresholds, we should focus on promoting internal pluralism. So I think that just having ownership restrictions to say that we protect media pluralism, maybe it's not enough, especially considering the difficulties in defining media markets now with the convergence trends and considering how blurring these boundaries are. Which leads me to the second point I wanted to make on quotas, because I don't think that quotas work either. In what sense? I'm not sure how national measures work, but at least on European level, we have the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, as you correctly pointed out, and the European Works Quota Rule. And also, you correctly pointed out that we need a stronger implementation framework. However, quota of what? I wanted to ask, because this is what we should think of. European work under the Audiovisual Media Services Directive does not mean a quality content, does not refer to the quality of the content that needs to be provided. It just needs to be of European origin. So in that sense, a European type Big Brother program or a European origin Jersey Shore program would qualify as European work. So we should really think about what we want broadcasters or on-demand or internet service providers to actually provide as content in terms of quotas. Thank you.
Yeah, I think they're all very fair comments. It's true that the measures which have been in place to secure pluralism haven't worked very effectively, and there's lots of evidence in the high levels of concentrations that we see all around. At the same time, if you do want to encourage more pluralistic systems of media provision, and if you do have a concern about concentrations of ownership, then I guess it's incumbent upon us to look at what are the range of tools available and to strengthen the ones that aren't working well, and to look at new and more inventive ways that more pertinently capture and address that where the problems are. So I'm not sure if you're arguing against regulation or arguing in favour of improved interventions, and I would certainly agree that improved interventions are needed for sure.
I would say against regulation, just to clarify this. Yes, I think it's the region.
Very last question to Stephen.
This really is a question to Eli. One of your charts, which I was really interested in, was I think it was the number of voices per capita. A brief look at that showed that Ireland, in the 4 or 5 years between the two studies, had suddenly almost doubled the number of voices, whereas Finland had plummeted. Ireland, as far as I know, has had at least a couple of newspapers closing down. Finland, over the last 10 years, 8 out of the last 10 years, has come top of the World Press Freedom Index. Now, I don't know how you compute those changes over time, but those two countries both stood out as having major changes in those period, but they both seem to be counterintuitive.
First, in some ways, the question should be addressed through me to the individual authors on Finland and on Ireland. But behind that might be in the case of Ireland, a demerger of a media company or something along these lines. Possibly, I have to look at the particularities of the Irish situation. And as to Finland, it's not just newspapers. Actually, the concentration of some other media industries in Finland is actually quite remarkable. In radio, for example, there's really very kind of the YLE public broadcaster is kind of vastly dominant when it comes to radio. I believe it is similar to in television. So newspapers is only one of the dimensions of these media. But I will be happy to look at these particularities of Finland and Ireland and correspond with you on that.
Well, thank you. We have to stop. Discussion continue over lunch, 1 hour sharp. Thank you.